Of course, here's a rewritten version of your scene, keeping the tension, drama, and emotional weight intact, while tightening the flow and heightening the impact. The studio lights blazed like 1,000 suns. Behind the polished glass table, world leaders sat motionless, faces taut with anticipation. At the center, U.S. President Donald Trump leaned forward, his voice cutting through the live global feed. African nations speak of dignity, but where is your power? Where is your influence? Leadership isn't given, it's earned. A murmur rippled through the room. Beside Rwanda's president sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, composed and still, fingers interlaced neatly. He didn't flinch, his silence roared louder than applause. The air thickened, even the camera crew froze. Trump smirked, certain he had dominated the moment. Leadership, he repeated, is not for those who beg at the table. Then slowly Traoré shifted. He turned and met Trump's eyes with an unblinking, steady gaze. You're not fit to lead the world, he said. Gasps filled the room. A collective heartbeat skipped, then silence. Deafening silence. Somewhere backstage, a producer dropped their headset. The camera zoomed in, catching Trump's jaw tightening. In that instant, the world shifted. Within minutes, #TRAOREVs Trump trended across 40 countries. But inside the Geneva studio, no one moved. Trump's face stiffened. Words tangled on his tongue. Excuse me, he finally managed, voice sharp. What did you say? Traoré remained calm, unflinching. I said you are not fit to lead the world because leadership demands humility. And the world, he paused, is tired of being condescended to. The air crackled. One African delegate quietly wiped his eye. The broadcast continued, cameras, switching between Traoré's serene expression and Trump's rising fury. You come here to insult me, Trump snapped. I gave your continent aid. Respect. You gave us what served your interests, Traoré replied, voice soft but unyielding. Not what honored us. Trump's face flushed red, but no moderator dared intervene. Around the globe, viewers leaned in. Children in Ouagadougou watched alongside their mothers. Veterans in Detroit turned up the volume. African students in Paris blinked back tears. For the first time, someone spoke not with rage, but with truth, and the world was unprepared. Backstage, CNN anchor Danielle Maurice wiped her cheek. She had covered wars, scandals, revolutions, but this moment was different. Her earpiece crackled. Stay with this. Viewership is skyrocketing. Stepping into frame, her voice trembled. We may be witnessing one of the most historic live exchanges in recent political memory. In the background, Trump leaned back, lips pressed tight. How dare you lecture me, he growled, but Traoré didn't fight. His voice remained steady. The world is not your audience, it is your responsibility. Then, unexpectedly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, faded photograph. Slowly he held it up. Would you like a few variations? For example, more cinematic version, more intense drama version, more courtroom-style debate version, more emotional/inspirational version. If you tell me the tone you're aiming for, I can tailor it. Absolutely. Here's a rewritten, polished version of your entire scene while keeping the powerful emotional weight and cinematic tension intact. The studio lights blazed like 1,000 suns. Behind the gleaming glass table, world leaders sat, frozen, their faces stiff with tension. At the center, U.S. President Donald Trump leaned forward, voice cutting through the live global broadcast. African nations speak of dignity, Trump said, his tone sharp. But where is your power? Where is your influence? Leadership isn't given, it's earned. A quiet murmur swept through the room. Beside Rwanda's president sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, composed, hands neatly folded, face unreadable. His silence was thunderous. The air thickened. Even the camera crew stood frozen. Trump smirked, certain of his dominance. Leadership, he repeated, is not for those who beg at the table. Slowly Traoré turned to face him. His eyes locked on Trump's with an unsettling calm. You're not fit to lead the world, he said, softly but firmly. Gasps rippled through the room. The silence that followed was suffocating. A producer backstage dropped their headset. The cameras zoomed in, catching Trump's jaw stiffening within minutes. #TRAOREVs Trump was trending across continents. But inside the Geneva studio, no one moved. Trump's lips twitched, with the words tangled in his throat. Excuse me, he finally managed, voice tight. What did you say, Traoré? Didn't he blink? I said you are not fit to lead the world because true leadership requires humility. And the world, he added, is tired of being spoken down to. The air sparked with electricity. One African delegate quietly wiped away a tear. You come here to insult me, Trump snapped, his voice rising. I gave your continent aid. Respect. You gave us what served you, Traoré replied, voice calm as ever. Not what honored us. The room held its breath. Viewers across the world leaned in closer. In Ouagadougou, children sat beside their mothers. In Detroit, veterans turned up the volume. In Paris, African students wiped tears from their cheeks. For the first time, someone was speaking not with rage, but with truth, and the world wasn't ready. Backstage, CNN anchor Danielle Maurice wiped her eyes. Her earpiece buzzed. Stay on this. Viewership is skyrocketing. She stepped into frame, her voice trembling. We are witnessing what may be one of the most historic live moments in recent political memory. Trump leaned back, visibly unsettled. What gives you the right to question me? He suddenly burst out. You, who were born in a country with no power, no economy, no seat at the table. What gives you the right? The room went cold. Captain Ibrahim Traoré remained still, unflinching, his hands folded, his face calm. Then he answered, the same, a thing that gave my mother the right to carry water for our family under the scorching sun. Survival woman in the back gasped. One of the moderators lowered her eyes. You lead from podiums, Traoré continued. We lead from pain. This silence was different, heavier, the kind that wraps around the chest and squeezes. Trump opened his mouth again, but Traoré raised one hand gently, but with authority. Let me finish. And somehow, even Trump listened. Because this wasn't just a response, it was a quiet storm. Traoré reached into his breast pocket and unfolded a worn, sun-faded photograph. Slowly, he held it up for the world to see. It showed a young African woman standing barefoot beside a clay house, a baby in one arm, a bucket of water balanced on her head. Her eyes were tired but proud. This is my mother, Traoré said, his voice soft. She was 16 when she gave birth to me. She died before I turned 12. I never knew anything but hunger and heat until I joined the army. This picture is all I carry with me when I travel. Not a flag, not medals. She reminds me who I fight for. The studio eyes turned away, blinking fast. One journalist wiped away a tear. Mr. Trump, Traoré continued, voice quivering just enough to break something inside everyone watching. You think leadership is about titles and trophies, but for some of us, it's about not letting our mothers die in vain. The world watched, silent and still. Even Trump did. You insult Africa, Traoré said, but Africa gave birth to me, and I will never forget her. Social media erupted into chaos. Millions were already calling it the Geneva moment. But inside the studio, time seemed to freeze. Trump's voice cracked as he lashed out bitterly. So what's your plan then, Captain? To scold us into silence? Traoré calmly turned to the moderators, then back to Trump. No, my plan is to remind the world that power is not truth, and sometimes truth must come from those you least expect. His voice was steady, wiser than politics. You say Africa has no power, he added, pausing. But what we have, what you've lost, is humility. That word echoed, humility across the world. Families watched together. People in airports, taxis, classrooms all held their breath. Leadership without humility, Traoré finished softly, is just a performance. Trump leaned back, jaw clenched tight, but his eyes flickered with something unexpected. Was it respect? Fear? Both. Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply inhaled, exhaled, and in that breath, the world heard something rare. New kind of leadership. Quiet, painful, real, and deeply human. The word still hung in the air. You're not fit to lead the world. The cameras zoomed in. Trump's face was rigid, his lips pressed thin. His eyes betrayed shock, fury, and for the first time, something that looked like silence. Not a single person spoke. Not the moderators, not the delegates, not the crew. The moment stretched, heavy like the seconds before a storm. And Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat calm as a river, steady, unmoving. Would you like me to also prepare a film script version, more visual and screenplay style, a viral social media transcript version, a novel dramatic chapter version, or an even more cinematic dialogue cut? Tell me what format you're aiming for and I can tailor it perfectly. Of course, here's a polished rewrite of your powerful scene, keeping the emotion, cinematic tension, and global resonance intact. Suddenly, Trump's voice cut through the silence, sharp, low, and tight with frustration. Who do you think you are? But Traoré didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Trump, steady and unyielding. I am the son of a continent that survived slavery, colonization, and endless war, he said, his voice steady. I am the voice of millions who refuse to be silent any longer. The studio froze. In that moment, it was no longer just a confrontation between two men. It was history itself standing on trial, holding up a mirror to the world. As cameras kept rolling, Traoré leaned forward, his voice calm yet heavy with conviction. Leadership isn't measured by the size of your bank account or by how many missiles you command. It's measured by the courage to face uncomfortable truths. Trump's jaw tightened again, but now Traoré was no longer addressing just him. He was speaking to every young African watching from small villages, every mother struggling to feed her children, every person who had ever been told they were insignificant. His words were not defiance alone, they were hope. Our strength, Traoré continued, comes from resilience, from rising despite the world's doubt. The studio lights seemed to dim, narrowing their focus onto Traoré's calm face, a man quietly carrying the weight of his people's pain, pride, and history on his shoulders. Across the globe, something shifted. An unexpected spark lit millions of hearts. Within minutes, the moment exploded across social media. Trump trended worldwide. Some cheered Traoré's courage. Others rushed to defend Trump's legacy. But one thing was undeniable. The The world was watching and listening like never before. In homes from Nairobi to New York, families paused their dinners to replay the moment. In Paris, young African activists shared the clip with tears in their eyes. Even seasoned journalists called it one of the most powerful political moments of the decade. And inside the Geneva studio, the air was still electric. Trump, shaken but trying to mask it, glanced across the table. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Traoré, however, sat silent, proud, knowing this was bigger than any one man. This was a call to the world to rethink, to reflect, and to rise. Behind the scenes, the studio fell into a heavy, whispered tension as cameras powered down. Producers huddled, murmuring nervously. The silence in the room spoke louder than any headline. In a small room away from the noise, Traoré sat alone. His eyes were tired but resolute. His mind drifted home, back to the village of his childhood, where electricity was a rare gift and clean water a distant dream. He saw his mother again, her hands rough, cracked from years of labor, her eyes always shining with hope as she reached for him. That memory was his true source of strength. Elsewhere in the main hall, Trump's advisors scrambled. A man who was used to dominating every room felt the sting of a truth he hadn't expected. Traoré's words had done more than rattle him. They had pierced through decades of silence. Outside, reporters swarmed, eager to unpack the gravity of what had just unfolded. Social media was ablaze with messages of pride, solidarity, and fierce debate. For Traoré, this was only the beginning. Hours later, thousands of miles away, a quiet prayer echoed in his mind. His mother's voice, though long gone, still alive. Within him, may you always stand for what is right, even when the world tries to silence you. Those words had carried him through sleepless nights of preparation, through battles not just fought with weapons but with will. And as the world replayed the viral clip over and over again, in a distant African village, a young mother held her baby close. She was one of millions who saw in Captain Traoré not just a leader but a brother, a son, a reflection of their own struggles, their own hopes. Traoré's confrontation was more than a political moment. It was a declaration of dignity for a continent that had long been sidelined. And as debates raged across newsrooms and dinner tables, his mother's prayer became an unspoken anthem, rising from Africa's dust, steady, patient, and unstoppable. In the days that followed, something remarkable began to stir. World leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens from every corner of the globe began speaking of the moment when one man stood tall and spoke truth to power. And quietly, a new kind of leadership was born. Would you like me to now create a final, fully cinematic version for your full Geneva confrontation, a screenplay draft for filming a novel chapter with deeper character insight, or a speech transcript for the viral clip? Just tell me your next target. I can elevate it for maximum impact. Here's a polished rewrite of your powerful continuation. News outlets replayed the confrontation on endless loops. In classrooms across continents, children watched wide-eyed, whispering to each other about a different kind of leader, one who spoke with honesty, humility, and heart. In Washington, some politicians shifted uneasily in their seats. For the first time in a long while, many asked themselves the question they had long avoided. What does true leadership look like? Traoré's calm defiance had ignited something far greater than controversy. It wasn't a fire of anger. It was a fire of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could change. That voices once silenced could now rise. That dignity, long denied, could finally find its rightful place at the global table. And deep inside, Traoré knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult road. The world was watching. And now, for the first time, it was beginning to truly listen. The morning after the broadcast, Traoré rose before dawn. The weight on his shoulders was immense. The eyes of millions had turned to him. Farmers struggling against drought, children yearning for an education, families praying for peace. He felt their hopes pressing against him like an invisible tide. In a small private room, Traoré allowed himself a brief moment of vulnerability. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a faded photograph of his father, his first hero, the man who taught him resilience long before he understood politics. Tears welled in his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. There was no room for doubt. Not now. The world expected strength, and strength he would give them. Meanwhile, in villages across Africa, something powerful had begun to stir. Mothers who had once feared for their children's future spoke now with renewed hope. Young men and women, long sidelined and dismissed, felt an unfamiliar courage rise within them. Traoré's words had become more than a speech. They had become an anthem. In a bustling market in Ouagadougou, an elderly woman clutched her small radio, tears streaming down her face. "He speaks like one of us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He tells the truth." In cities far away, African students gathered in small rooms, organizing new debates about power, dignity, and leadership. The old ways of submission were cracking. The narrative was shifting. The world was beginning to see Traoré not just as a leader but as a symbol of something far deeper: dignity, strength, and hope. His message was simple: the future belongs to those who refuse to be invisible. Back in Geneva, Beneath a calm facade, a fierce battle was unfolding. Traoré faced not only political resistance, but the invisible forces that had always worked in the shadows, forces that sought to silence voices like his. Threats arrived quietly, whispered warnings in backrooms, anonymous phone calls in the dead of night. But he did not waver. His staff saw it daily, a man who carried not only his own dreams, but the collective hope of an entire continent. Late one evening, as rain poured against the windows, Traoré sat alone, staring out over the city lights. He thought of his people. He thought of every sacrifice made along the way, and in that quiet solitude he made a vow. No matter the cost, he would not back down, because this was no longer about politics. It was a fight for the soul of his people. Days later, the world held its breath as Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the global stage once more, this time at the historic United Nations summit. The grand hall was silent, every seat filled, every eye fixed on him. But Traoré wasn't looking at the diplomats, nor the presidents, nor the cameras. He looked beyond them, toward the millions watching from dusty villages, crowded cities, and quiet living rooms around the world. His voice was steady, but carried the full weight of history. "I am not here to challenge anyone's power," he began softly. "I am here to demand respect. Respect for those whose voices have too long been dismissed. Respect for the mothers who carry water for miles, for the children who study by candlelight, for the men and women who rise every morning to fight for a dignity denied to them." The chamber remained frozen. His words cut through the air like a blade, quiet, deliberate, undeniable. "The world doesn't need more rulers," Traoré continued. "It needs more listeners, more servants, more leaders willing to stand in the shadows and lift others into the light." The entire hall sat in stunned silence. And in that moment, once again, the world felt the quiet rise of a new kind of leadership. Not one born from force, but one born from truth. If you want, I can now continue to craft the UN Summit full speech, the next chapter of the global movement. An emotional scene of private reflection or a cinematic script version. Just say the word and I'll build the next step of Traoré's journey. Of course, here's a polished rewrite of your passage. They had been silenced for too long, and now finally someone spoke for them. Traoré's words reached far beyond the walls of that hall. They touched something deep in the hearts of millions. Parents dreaming of a better future for their children. Young people starving for change. Ordinary men and women who had long given up on the idea that anyone truly listened in that moment. Ibrahim Traoré became more than a leader. He became a symbol of hope, a symbol of dignity, a symbol of courage. As his message spread like wildfire, reactions poured in from every corner of the world. Supporters rallied, inspired by his calm strength. Critics tried to tear him down, but their words rang hollow in the shadow of the truth he had spoken. In Africa, communities gathered to celebrate. In classrooms, children now learned not just about the power of wealth or armies, but about the power of standing tall for what is right. And even in countries where politics was bitter and divisive, people found themselves moved, some to tears, others to reflection. For many, Traoré had reignited a long-dormant belief that leaders could still be honest, that they could still be compassionate, that they could still be brave. His confrontation with Trump was no longer just a political moment. It had become something far greater, a beacon in a world that was slowly starting to shift. Months passed, and still the viral clip remained a symbol of transformation. It was shown in schools, debated in parliaments, whispered about in coffee shops. Everywhere, his quiet courage continued to inspire. But while the world debated, Traoré pressed forward. He did not lead with arrogance or pride. He led with humility and an unbreakable commitment to his people. He traveled from dusty villages to crowded cities, visiting schools and marketplaces, always listening, always learning, always fighting for justice. One quiet evening beneath the endless African sky, Traoré paused to reflect on the path that had brought him here. He thought of the mothers who still whispered prayers for their children, of the young boys and girls who now dared to dream bigger, of the countless faces filled with hope. His eyes welled, not with sorrow but with profound gratitude. This was more than leadership. This was love. And in that love, he found the strength to carry on. Thank you for being part of this journey. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps spread this message of hope and courage to even more people. Together, we can build a world where every voice is heard. Let's keep this conversation alive. I look forward to reading your thoughts. Would you like me to now rewrite the whole full story into a complete, polished short story version, or a screenplay version, or perhaps a motivational speech version of Traoré's UN address? Just say the word.